give us 5 minutes, 7 minutes, in that kind of range, as to how you come to this work? I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to share with people is not just what somebody's work is and what they're discovering, but what's motivating them, what's driving their learning, why is it they care about this? Maybe you could start with what turns you on and has, brought you to this work in your life.
Sure. My name is Madhu Viswanathan, and I have a mechanical engineering degree in almost like a previous birth, it seems like, and then I changed over and I did a PhD in management and marketing. And marketing as a discipline is a very wide area. It's not marketing as the vernacular, which is more of, how do you sell something and so on. It's a very broad area with a variety of perspectives, disciplinary perspectives as well. And early on in my career, the publish or perish mode, I studied how consumers use numbers and words. And I did some work on nutrition labeling. But as I approached tenure, I thought about what I really want to do when I grow up. And there were really two things of great interest to me. One of them was in the area of measurement and research design. And to me, it was an issue of how scientists use numbers. And that's an area I worked and published in. The other area was on low literate, innumerate consumers. And I came to this because I would often sit at seminars and talk about, here we are designing nutrition labels, but what percentage of the population does not use these labels and so on. And I think at some point in time, I heard myself saying it. And that's how I got into this whole area. And there was really no research from a consumer behavior point of view, consumer psychology point of view. And so it was fascinating to enter it. And it was also a very different kind of method that I had to use, more of qualitative research and observations and interviews and so on. So that's how I came about, and I've now been in this area for about 8 years, and my interests continue to grow. It's been fascinating to look at some of the problems that low literate consumers face, and I've studied this both here in the US and also in a very different culture in India among the poor as well. So that's how I came about, and I think I'm going to stay in this area for a long time. So.
Great, thank you. For somebody who hasn't tracked with you before in this space, how about you describe why it's important to develop a consumer marketing dimension, understanding of the difficulties of connecting with people that have low literacy? I mean, why is it valuable to do this?
Sure. I think in some sense I come to it with already the disciplinary bias in terms of marketing and consumer behavior. But I think a large part of people's lives are really in the economic realm as consumers. And in a poorer setting like India, a large part of people's lives, if they are low literate or poor, is both as buyers and sellers. Their way out economically or their way up economically is to run a very small business, to be a seller and so on. To me, this whole area is interesting. And again, my path to it was through looking at how people use numbers. And here I ended up serendipitously studying a group who use very little information, but most of what they use is numerical or numbers. I'm sorry, I went off on a tangent there, but I think to me, the consumer realm is a very important part of day-to-day life where literacy plays out. And the consumer realm is also a very important part of day-to-day life where literacy skills are learned. I may not be able to tell you in the abstract what 5 plus 3 is, or what happens, what 5 minus 3 is, but if I go to a McDonald's, in that context-rich environment that I've been to before, I may be able to do the mathematics of it. And so to me, in some ways, the basic literacy skills could develop from a consumer-oriented environment as well.
So in that sense, you could almost say that the consumer relationship, consumer behavior relationship with the world, so to speak, is a literacy environment.
Absolutely, and that raises a very interesting issue, which is what are the skills required in the Western world to negotiate the consumer environment compared to the skills required say, in India. These are very different skills in the poor environment in India versus the environment here. Functional literacy is defined as having this adequate skills to function in day-to-day life, and this is an important part of it. And the key here is that what I need to function here in the US with large institutions and high technology is quite different from what I may need to function in India. And I think there are some very interesting and counterintuitive kinds of observations I have about that as well. I guess what's leading me in this is my bias. I look at the world in terms of consumers and the problems they may face, and but I would argue that a big part of where literacy plays out is in the consumer realm. So.
I thought it was interesting, kind of cycling all the way back to the beginning for a moment, that you mentioned that you had this interest in how consumers use letters and numbers, which in a way led you to the realization of the dimension of the population that's not using it so well, low literacy. Can you talk about how you got from less of a concern about low literacy and more of a concern of just the kind of general letters, numbers, consumer behavior thing, to how that led you to low literacy?
That is an interesting question. I'm thinking back to how my interest evolved in this, and I think part of it was trying to understand numeracy. Part of it, I'd done some work on people's basic preference for numerical information. Part of it was more in terms of realizing that here we are in consumer behavior, consumer psychology, and I would argue in psychology as well, studying human beings, but we tend to study people who are literate. And it's easier, it's more convenient, and that's where our most, if not all of our models, I would say most of our models have developed. And so, to me, it was very interesting to look beyond. And in a way, the way I think I've approached it is, yes, my interest is in the consumer realm, but the insights could come from a variety of disciplines and could educate us. So in a way, very often the way we approach a qualitative interview is to say, okay, tell me about yourself, tell me about your life. And then we bring in some focus on the consumer realm, but we're really interested in understanding how people live and how they negotiate a variety of things in life and how that interrelates with consumer behavior. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but
that's okay. We're learning to communicate right now.
Yeah.
I really appreciate where you're coming from. I also I appreciate what you said a moment ago about the almost taken for granted black hole in our psychological sciences, in that by default they are studying the people that they can communicate with through literacy mechanisms, and that what that means is, depending on the dimension of the population that we say has low literacy, is that to that extent, in a way, our psychology models based on interpretations of people that we're having exchanges with that are going through the channel of literacy in one form or another, that our models are biased in a way that are not considering those critical aspects of this whole other dimension of the population.
And we generally have several degrees. We tend to, as human beings, whether we are scientists or not, we tend to impose our own view of the world, or we tend to think that others may, think through a process the way we do. And so that leads to a lot of biases as well. If, and our models are based on literate people. The same thing happens with managers. And I think the same thing could happen with educators. A lot of people in decision-making roles have to essentially have a lot of imagination to see the world from the eyes of somebody who has a lower level of literacy, because literacy is something we have taken for granted. We've pretty much always had it as long as we could remember. And I think there are a lot of biases playing in here. And I've always felt that scientists, at least social scientists, tend to over-intellectualize processes and so on, because we want something to talk about. We want to believe that there are a lot of these processes underlying day-to-day thinking and so on. So we have that bias as well. And I think it all combines. And in a way, the thing that struck me first about my own research was the things we take for granted. It is amazing what my shopping trip looks like versus somebody with a lower level of literacy, because 80% of it probably are things that they struggle with are things that I probably don't even give any thought to. And so I think this requires a radical shift in thinking among decision makers to address some of the issues here. And this includes business, it includes education, it includes policy makers, and so on. So.
Well, I'm struck with the notion of taking for granted, in that the code as a whole is taken for granted. And for the most part, in the teaching of children and adults, it is so difficult, just as you said, for most people that are literate to experience the kind of confusions that are being experienced by somebody who's not. You no longer experience the world. It's like saying, I cannot experience the world as a 6-month-old baby anymore. I can't experience the world in a way that a woman might, or an animal might, or whatever. I mean, there is such a radical difference in that frame of reference that we have in the way that we think. So I appreciate what you're saying, all the way down to the level of taking the code for granted and taking our experience in the old adage, carpenters see nails. So we're particularly interested in, where we're coming at all this, we're particularly interested in helping people understand that there is a very significant interactive psychological component to reading struggles, that people who have protracted difficulty with reading, with learning to read, develop various types of almost automatic emotional aversions to certain kinds of confusions. And so they're going around trying to avoid these things, and it's harming their learning more generally than just the absence of literacy in particular. And it's that dimension that it seems to kind of intersect between us as you talk about low literacy and consumer behavior in particular, particularly as it relates to the embarrassment dimensions, what you've been able to cull out of that research. So this interview is very informal. We're going to use the jewels that get clipped along the way. We're going to share with you a transcript of the whole thing so that you can do what's right with it from your perspective. I'm interested in getting at what you think are the top 5 to 10 striking points of the work that you've come across, the things that surprised you or that you think are least understood out there in the world that you've come across in the course of your work. So that's one field of our conversation. The other field is I'm interested in getting at how it is that people with low literacy are going around pulled back, hiding, protecting, and what you've been able to do to kind of bring that out. And in terms of how it is that they're behaving in consumer contexts, you might say. So, having said that, you can go off on whichever one of those things kind of interests you the most.
Sure. One of the first things we confronted in looking at this whole issue is it is not easy to access to talk to people who have lower levels of literacy. This is almost a problem where people hide from their country and countries hide from the world, right? Literacy is something of prestige. And so the first issue was, how do we even find people to talk to? And we took a road where, which was based on convenience, that we decided to talk to students at adult education centers. Now, how do you approach this problem? This is not something where you send out a few mail surveys, obviously. And so we decided to take a much more qualitative approach talk to people, talk to students, talk to teachers, observe students in the shopping place, in a store and so on. So right away, the big adjustment was methodological. And this is not something where we could use experiments right away. We needed to educate ourselves. And in some ways, maybe we, and by that I mean folks who have PhDs, are probably the least qualified. And so one thing we did was we trained ourselves as tutors, and we tutored students. Another thing we did was we developed a relationship, particularly with people who had were at the low end of the scale in terms of reading and math scores. And we didn't interview them until we had perhaps tutored them at least a few times. And so we let about a year and a half go before there were some interviews were conducted. So the other thing we did was we observed people in the store. So I think a big part of this is the methodology. And a lot of things we take for granted as researchers in terms of the method needed to be thought through.
Excuse me, right on that point. Did you develop some kind of a profiling system that your different data gathering fed into?
You mean in terms of the profile of the respondent?
Yeah, right.
One thing we had information on, and which adult education centers tend to do, is put people into 0 to 4 or 5 through 8 or 9 through 12 in terms of reading and math scores. That I think was the biggest part, and there were quite a few striking differences between those who were at the 0 to 4 level versus the others. And so we looked at reading and math scores at entry, and we looked at where people were in terms of reading and math scores.
Did you track other kinds of psychometric or SES or race ethnicity or work backgrounds, or what other information did you track the process?
I think we would ask about people's lives. We'd asked about their work, but we didn't do anything quantitative with it. Now we are at the point 8 years later where we're doing some experiments where we bring in income and so on, but that's more as a control variable. So that's where we are. And in some ways, I think what we do is what could be described as more of existence research rather than incidence research. So we don't know to what extent some of the problems we saw happen, but I think we have a sense of the fact that it does happen and it can happen. And so ours is more small scale and it's more in-depth rather than, say, a literacy survey where we have a much broader sense of how often something happens. I think the first time I went out observing people, we gave them a task. We said, well, here's $50 and you need to buy these 6 things. And I think the thing that amazed me was, again, as I said earlier, the things we take for granted. I go to a store, I make a few trade-offs in terms of what I'm getting for what I'm giving. I go to the counter, I may be short of money once in a while. To me, it's not a big deal. And I put some things back and I leave. Now, when I observed people, it was amazing how much of the effort they put was spent on perceptual kinds of things that I had not even thought about. Finding something in a store, reading a sign. Once you find where something is located, looking at where the price tag is, finding the right price, reading the price. And that can be quite confusing. If one costs $1.50, how much does 2 cost? I need to buy 2 of those, and that would require basically doing some computation, sometimes even manual computation with a paper and pencil in the store. If I need 150 candles, I need a box of 100 and I need a box of 50. So I need to make sure I find those 2 and I need to add them up. I remember percentage off signs. I remember one gentleman who essentially looked at some great deals and walked away. 70% off and so on. And he said, look, I don't know how to compute it. So I don't buy if it says percentage off because I don't know what the final price is. And I don't want to go through this process of going up to the counter and essentially asking them to compute it for me. Some of them said, well, I can deal with half off or 50%, but I cannot deal with 30% off or 70% off. So percentage signs are confusing. Simple computations often require manual calculations. I had asked people to buy about 6 things for $50. Now, often what would happen is somebody would buy one item and then maybe it cost $1.50. And in my mind, I would estimate and say, yeah, I have enough left, let me move on. But often people needed to compute to try to figure out that, yes, I have $48.50 left. And then, and then they would be comfortable moving to the next item. So the whole idea of magnitudes, adding up a shopping basket. And this is interesting because a lot of what we did was observation. And very often, you look at somebody and they're shopping and, it's hard to tell just from looking. And, this is not something where, you look at somebody and, you can say, well, what's their literacy level, which is good, that it's not possible to look at people and identify and so on. So we would observe people, and these are people who agreed and who participated in our study, of course. And there would be clues along the way. And so here is a shopper. She looks like a very safe shopper. She opens things. She checks everything. And then along the way, there's a shopping basket. And, we had given about $10 for people to spend. And there's $30 or $40 worth. And she turns to me and says, well, would that be $10 worth? So there's a clue there that the problem is in adding up the shopping basket. So those are some of the things we observed. Unit prices are too abstract. People don't use unit prices. A lot of these nice solutions from a literate point of view are just not solutions at the other end. They're just too abstract. So these were some of the things we observed. Go ahead.
While we're in this space, were there examples that were less to do with numeracy and computation and more to do with being able to read and comprehend that more complex information in the choice process?
Quite a bit of the observations we did with people who are at the low end of the literacy scale. And I think there were a few things we inferred. Just to back up, let me just add a couple more things. But for example, a couple of other things that happened were that taxes were a big concern. There's some tax added on. So the rule of thumb would be, well, I've got $5, I'll buy one thing. So, these were some of the concerns, and we tried to step back and say, what have we learned from it? And I think in the range of people we talked to, I don't believe, at least I think it's a limitation of our own questioning and where we were in our knowledge, it never got to complex trade-offs. It was often an issue, or I should say it rarely got to complex trade-offs. It was often an issue of trying to negotiate and somehow dealing with all the perceptual information. And very often, with all the effort I was talking about in terms of reading a price and so on, the decision making was, well, I found it, I'll take it. Or I found it, I've read the price, I can afford it, I'll take it. So, we really didn't get to the point where there was a trade-off and saying, well, this is what I'm getting here, this is what I'm getting here, and so on. It was often based on a single attribute like price. If there was a comparison, it was often, well, I'm going to buy the cheapest, and so on. So those were the kinds of things that we observed. And one thing related to this, often people told us before adult education, they would just grab what looked good and put it in their basket. Adult education taught them to be careful and to look for information. But often the kind of information they were able to look for would be price, because so much of effort is being spent finding the store, reading a sign, finding the product, reading a price, and so on. And so there was very little effort left to actually spend on the kinds of things I would do if I go to a store, which is trade off, compare on some attributes, what am I getting, what am I giving, what are the discounts, and so on. What are some broader themes that we learned from this? I think one fundamental thing I learned, and almost right away, was what I call concrete thinking, which is really, focusing on one concrete piece of information and using that to guide decision making, rather than making abstractions such as, what am I giving up, what am I getting back? Just to give you one example, we would often start openly and ask people, where do you shop, and how do you buy bread, and so on, and people would say, well, I buy the cheapest. What if there are two different sizes of bread? I buy the cheapest. And then we get more focused and ask them, well, what if one loaf of bread is $1, another loaf of bread, 2 times the size, is $1.50, which would you buy? I would buy the cheapest. So very often there was this underlying rule based on one concrete piece of information, price. And so that was very interesting. I'm just going to stop there and rewind to a study that was done in the 1920s by a Russian psychologist, Luria. And he would essentially, he studied low literate peasants in Central Asia, I'm sorry. And he would basically ask people, he would show people, let's say a saw, an axe, a hammer, and he would ask them, what's the word for this? And so essentially he was trying to make them abstract and say the word tools, for example. And they would come back and say, well, if I had a tree, I can chop it up. I need some wood and I can use these tools. And so they would often answer to suggest that their thinking was in the immediate visual graphic world of how they would use these things. And the reason I'm mentioning that is this idea of concrete thinking is not really that different. It's basically the idea that, well, I'm not going to abstract up in a buying situation, but I'm going to use price. I better learn to use price, otherwise I'm going to be caught without money at the counter. I have to use price to transact, and so that's the attribute I choose to engage in this concrete thinking. There are others occasionally who would say, well, yeah, I buy the one with the most sugar or something like that. But this whole idea of concrete thinking is really focusing on one piece of information and not even sometimes making the trade-off between price and size.
Excellent. I appreciate the Russian study in terms of staying inside that concrete security zone rather than going out into the abstract. And one of the questions that I wanted you to get back to where you were, but I want you to let linger in the back of your mind here is, to what extent is the lack of movement from the concrete to the more general and abstract a psychological defense, To what extent is it just a lack of exercise in abstractness and as a consequence of not having the exercise that goes with being more literate?
Oh, that's a great question, I think. And I'm going to come back and try to answer it in a different way, in contrasting what I've seen in India and what I've seen here. And I hope that addresses the question. So one of the things is concrete thinking. Now, concrete thinking could be because of low income. I buy the cheapest because that's all I can afford. But that is not what we were seeing. What we were seeing is that this was a rule, people were using it, and there are a lot of abstractions in a consumer setting. One is price and size, and then price, what I'm giving up versus what I'm getting, a range of attributes and so on. And so that was the kind of thing. And there was a related phenomenon in that people would try to concretize decision making. In many ways, they would go to familiar stores. They would go to stores where the layout wouldn't change. There were people who knew how to look for expiry dates, but they really didn't know what it meant on a milk carton or something like that. Some people would know how to buy the blue or the red carton, but they didn't know why they were doing that. So it was often, depending on some concrete piece of information as a way to concretize their decision making, but they didn't understand why that was being done. So that was one big thing that we found, concrete thinking. The other thing we found was pictographic thinking. Now, pictographic thinking, everybody does pictographic thinking, but we mean a lot more than the normal pictographic. Pictographic thinking, well, I look at a picture in a box and I buy it. I see an ad, I see the picture, I come to the store, I see it again, I buy it. But let me give you an example to describe pictographic thinking. One gentleman, about 38 years old when we interviewed him. He had been in the tough streets. He had lived a tough life. He could count because he had to count to survive, particularly counting money and so on. But he could not read. And this goes back to the shame issue. And what he would do to negotiate the environment would be to tap somebody in the shoulder, perhaps at the store, and he would say, hey, I have this problem with my eyes. I can't see. So can you read that out for me? And so that's how we would negotiate the environment. Now, I was interviewing him, and it's one of those interviews where you talk to somebody and it's so enlightening. And he kept saying, I go in, I buy the same brand every week. And at some point I said, but you told me you can't read. So how do you buy the same brand? And he replied very appropriately. He said, there's nothing wrong with my eyes. And so to him, the brand name, the Coca-Cola or whatever, was not a word being read. It was a set of wiggly signs. It was an image. It was an object in a scene. And so he was essentially remembering that image. And that's what we mean by pictographic thinking. If I want to buy a cake, I could use the information and figure out how much of sugar I should buy and so on. But on the other hand, I could visualize the cake. I could visualize myself baking the cake. I could visualize myself pouring the sugar, and I could visualize the size of the package that I want, and then I could buy the sugar. So that's what we mean by pictographic thinking. And it's an entirely different, I think, realm than just saying, well, I look at pictures and I buy. So I think that is another very broad predilection that we found along with concrete thinking. And this again is similar to the psychologist Luria's idea that people live in the visual, immediate, graphic world, and that is a very basic sense all of us have. Whether we learned how to read or not, we can sense things, and we can,
right. Yeah. And there's a lot of people's work that are demonstrating more and more that native indigenous people that don't become literate stay living in a world that functions much more like we just described. Right? The dimensionality of our abstraction as a consequence of our literacy.
Absolutely, and in a way, I guess language is some collective knowledge. In a way, like culture, and here I'm a complete novice, so this is just me speculating. But I think in some sense, language is society's agreed upon way of communicating, and some of it is abstractions. And I think a lot of people who cannot read may be in more of a sensory world where they're visualizing things and so on. In fact, one of the things we're trying to show now is how low literate people may be able to do some tasks better than literate people. And only now, 8 years later, we are in the process of doing experiments. And one of the things we're trying to show is how if you move from words, and in our case, it's it could be brand names and so on, or words in a sentence, to just a word which could be looked at pictographically rather than a sentence which is maybe intimidating right away, to logos, to actually looking at a product in use and how that may improve memory for low literate people as we incorporate the context to a greater extent and make it richer. So those are two very broad kinds of cognitive predilections, concrete thinking and pictographic thinking. Now, in terms of decision making, what we essentially find is people either use a single attribute, like price, or they make decisions randomly, or they make decisions habitually. That's what my mother used to do, and so on. So that's what we find with decision making. A few other things, but I'll stop here.
Speak to those 2 points that you just raised.
Sure. So that's the decision-making part. Now, the typical approach to decision-making in a lot of the social sciences has been that, well, we trade off, we look at how important the decision is. If I'm buying a paper towel, I'm not going to spend too much effort on that decision. And so I'm going to, I don't need to be that accurate. So I'm going to, conserve my resources. Well, what is stark about low literate consumers is another huge dimension, which is maintaining self-esteem, which gets back to shame and so on. I may make a completely poor decision on the surface if it preserves my self-esteem. If I can hide perhaps my low level of literacy. And so this adds a whole different dimension, I think, which has not really been factored in to a lot of the research. It's not just, conserving resources. It's not some nice economic model where I'm saying I'm going to balance these two and I'm going to allocate resources. It's more, hey, how do I save face? And so this whole idea of self-esteem maintenance is something we've seen play out in a number of domains.
And even that's an intellectualization overlay, right? I mean, to them, they're not, self-esteem is a big abstraction. It's this, I'm afraid of having that feeling. So I'm going to do what I got to do to avoid that feeling.
Exactly. And so, a lot of the other things, as you mentioned, they do sound like real over-intellectualization in terms of balancing so many different things and so on. Self-esteem maintenance comes out in many ways. As I mentioned earlier, percentage off, I don't want to deal with it. Why? Well, why put myself through this position of asking somebody else to compute it? It certainly plays out at the counter. As I mentioned, I used this example where I may run short at the counter. No big deal for me. But we saw cases where people would be absolutely in despair if they ran short of money at the counter. And it certainly puzzled me at first as to, what's the big deal? But I think the big deal is here I am, and I'm supposed to know how much money, how much everything costs, and I'm short of money. And I think what's going on is the attribution for a low literate person is to their low level of literacy. To me, my attribution is, well, yeah, I forgot, having a busy day. And so that makes it very powerful that people essentially despair in that situation. On the other hand, when people have the right amount of money, we have seen where people related to us that they celebrate it. And so here's a very normal event in day-to-day life for me that I've never given any amount of thought. And that event could be cause for celebration or cause for despair. And that's the kind of self-esteem maintenance that we saw. So literally every encounter, every shopping encounter can be one where preserving self-esteem is paramount. If people told us, for example, I go to this particular store because the person at the counter smiles at me. Or I go to the store because, there's somebody there, somehow there's a relationship built, that person helps out. And so that person gives me a reason to go back to that store. So these are the very small kinds of things that make people loyal to a store. Something which gives them reason, something where people are not saying, hey, give me your money and get out. And, unfortunately, a lot of store environments seem to be like that to low literate people. And, this is one of my messages to, I think, the businesses out there, that if you study the segment, and if you really try to address their needs, you're going to benefit quite a bit as well. I mean, you're going to get loyalty, you're going to have a competitive advantage. But it's going to take some effort. It's not easy to understand low literate people. But, a lot of them may be your customers already. And so if you really want to serve them and you serve them well, you will get, it's a win-win situation, is my message, I think, to businesses out there.
Yeah, I hope you get that. Unfortunately, typically low literates, people with low levels of literacy, typically don't have the money or the capability of participating civilly, socially, politically, and so forth,
right,
to have any kind of collective constituency force.
Yeah.
Right? So except for people like yourself doing work to kind of champion their interests, even if it is in translating that into the economic best interests of others who might support them, they're otherwise pretty disconnected, unempowered, fragmentary group without constituency power.
Absolutely. And this is, again, a point I want to get back to, I think, with the other issue, which is compare across cultures. And my sense, and I'll come back to this, my sense is that low literate people here in the US are very isolated and very passive. One of the things we did is we compared, almost like an experiment, we also interviewed literate but poor people, a very small sample, again, of in-depth interviews. We also interviewed people with English as a second language who had been in the US, were not very familiar with the US environment, who are extremely literate. They're literate in more than one language. And so again, it was as a comparison group. One of the things we found was that people with low income who are literate, to some degree, tend to be much more willing to, argue, to fight for their rights, and to go to the manager and complain at a store and so on, compared to the low literate people. Somehow with lower levels of literacy, people get very isolated and passive. We even know of an example, for example, where a lady will not go to shop unless her brother from an adjoining state visits her and takes her out to shop. Otherwise, she's at home. And so, there are some very touching examples of this type as well. There's one more issue I just wanted to cover very quickly in terms of the basic research. We talked about the concrete thinking, pictographic. We talked about decision making and self-esteem maintenance. One thing, one broad area is coping, and it is amazing how much ingenuity there is in coping, given the skills that people have. And those skills are, the result of circumstances, they're a result of, not being able to study beyond a certain grade and so many different circumstances. But people learn to negotiate and cope. Some of the things we looked at were, in terms of coping, were things like dependence on others. And there could be extreme dependence. And the example I used just now in terms of a lady who would not shop unless a brother visited her, there's an example of extreme dependence. A lady who is about 60 years old told us, well, when I was young, my mother shopped, now my daughter shops. So she had delegated that job, to either generation because of low literacy. There's several types of coping. One of the most poignant, I think, moments in all of this was when a gentleman, when asked, how much money do you keep in the wallet and so on, basically, and actually it was not even that context, I'm sorry. It was more in the context of, he was talking about being cheated and so on, and he whipped out his wallet and it had a crisp $20 bill. And he said, that's all I carry, because that's the most I can get cheated out of. So that was his role to try to cope. There was another gentleman who said, look, every time I go, I think I'm being cheated. So what do I do about it? I buy less of what I want. And so somehow for him, by making the transaction smaller, he feels on any given occasion he's cheated. He may be cheated to a smaller amount. So there were a variety of coping mechanisms that people were coming up with to negotiate the environment. And so that's another, I think, part of all of this. And it was to negotiate the environment, and it was to maintain self-esteem at the same time.
Right. Fascinating. We're also interested in coping strategies, you might say, or the kind of internal self-talk that develops in children in particular, as they have protracted difficulties struggling with trying to get through the literacy barrier, and what, in order to protect themselves from the pain and shame, they tend to come up with, statements that are, I'm stupid, I'm just not smart, I can't learn, I'm this, I'm that, which protects them, takes them out.
How must that feel, to walk around and feel like you're being cheated all the time? And not knowing when you really are being cheated versus when you may not be being cheated at all, but you still feel like you are.
Right. And, it's a perception, and it's based on hard knocks. It's based on having been cheated out in large transactions. So we had several examples where people bought an automobile for, a couple of $1,000s, a used automobile, and it didn't work right away and so on. Those were the places where, there was quite a bit of cheating going on, often the one-on-one kind of situation. And people had really learned through hard knocks. But it was a burden they were carrying, that they knew they could be cheated at any given time, and often they perceived themselves being cheated. And then you combine that with this passive, isolated kind of feeling that I felt throughout, in terms of, or rather that I inferred just from the way people would react. They would rarely, I would say, go and complain and so on. They would just keep it within. And I wondered also about the attribution process. First of all, people may say, well, I've never been cheated. Quite a few people said that. And you wondered whether, it was because they didn't perceive themselves. I mean, they didn't catch the cheating occasion, or whether it was a defense mechanism.
They don't want to reveal the fact that they could be cheated that way.
Exactly. So it could be a defense mechanism. Secondly, there's the issue of, okay, I got cheated, but, I'm going to blame myself. I'm going to come up with some of the, similar to what you talked about with children. So I'm going to blame myself. And perhaps only the third or fourth step may be where they say, yes, I was cheated. And so, I would not think that the first attribution would be that I was cheated. I think a lot of people said, no, we've never been cheated. And, given some of the other things we observed, that didn't seem very likely. It seemed like they may have been cheated at some point in time. So yeah, it is, I've spent 8 years in this, and I don't think I can answer the question you raised in terms of what is it, how they go through the store, and what does it look like from, their eyes. It's a very difficult, it's beyond my imagination.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate how you're straddling both the reading dimensions and the math dimensions in your view of literacy. We are making a distinction in our work between reading, spelling, and math, all of which are artificial code processes, none of which have a organic evolutionary trajectory supporting. But that there's a remarkable difference between spelling, math, and reading, in that with spelling and math, you can actually bring your volitional, intentional focus to bear on the task, whereas with reading, it has to happen faster than you can consciously participate. So it's not that we are not concerned with these others, but we're concerned with kind of shining a light on this significantly artificially confusing relationship in which our brain is building this simulated language in relation to the information and instructions in a technology, in a code. And that if that doesn't form just right within a certain window, the cognitive infrastructure starts to go off in the wrong direction. And the possibility of this downward spiral of developing a psychological aversion to even wanting to do it the two start to work against it ever catching and people being trapped. And that's the core. And that once they're in that mode, then they're going to have spelling problems, they're going to have math problems, they're going to have lots of other problems. Having said that, I'm asking for you to draw out some more along the lines that you have been that might be helpful, that are more specific to the reading literacy dimension than the math-based decisions, relative to other examples that you may have encountered that illuminate the self-esteem, protectiveness, or the emotional dimension, or the avoidance, or anything that triggers for you.
So more on the reading.
More on the reading side of it, yeah.
One of the things we noticed when we were tutoring is, of course, when you read with somebody, there's so much going on where you're trying to understand a word in context. And I should admit here, I am somebody who's a complete novice on some of the basic literacy and basic reading kinds of things. So I should admit that I'm coming at it with my own tunnel vision from a different perspective. I think one of the things is how much we read based on context and the contextual information. And so, very often the errors when we tutor people would be, errors that perhaps literate people would not make, because they would read the word, they would have understood the context and so on. And again, I'm trying to go back to my own comfort zone in terms of consumer behavior. And I think so much of the skills in terms of reading and so on, whether it is reading as in pictographic kinds of things, where I'm remembering the word, I'm remembering the patterns. So much of that depends on reading it in that context. So I'm in a store, I can read that word, I can read that label because it's a familiar store, it's a familiar shelf, it's a familiar logo, and so on. But take me out of that comfort zone, and then I'm not able to transfer those same skills. So, that I think...
Like tacit knowledge in other dimensions. Like, I couldn't tell you how I ride a bike or how I make, spaghetti or something, but get me in the kitchen or get me on the bike and I know how to do it.
Right.
And so there's a difference between describing something and being able to do it. And this is, again, back to a more concrete, less abstract, simple one-to-one association between some kind of an image that represents a meaning, rather than something that has to be assembled from its letters and sounds.
To the extent that I'm carrying out a basic reading or a basic counting task, it is so context dependent. So, I am in that context, I'm in the comfort zone, now I can carry out the operations, whether it's reading or counting or, or whatever it may be. So I think that's one thing that is, that is striking, and I'm not able to think of several others. I keep going back to this whole idea of, reading can be pictographic, counting can be pictographic. And counting is pictographic in the sense that I'm moving a shopping cart along, and the way I'm counting for some people is I have these these dollar bills in my mind, and as I buy something, I'm taking it off in my mind, and so I'm counting, I'm adding and subtracting, but in a visual way. So somehow, again, I'm trying to make it a sensory kind of task rather than a more abstract counting or a reading task. So those were some of the things I think we saw. Nothing else comes to mind. I'm sure there are several others, but
no, it's fine, it's fine.
Yeah.
And the issue there, of course, is that the more that people do that, the further they are away from learning the skills that could break them through that. I mean, in the case of reading, the people that learn to guess from context or who get context-specific effects from image, treat alphabetic orthography like it was pictographic or ideographic are stuck at the level of whatever they can remember in terms of those symbols. They can't get out of the ceiling of that because they can't assemble new, previously unrecognized words.
Absolutely, and this is where I think the whole issue of functional literacy, again, I think is very relevant. I'm going to just talk a little bit about the work in India, more to answer your question in an indirect way. I would speculate from what I've seen in India, and again in India we have gone to poor neighborhoods and we've talked to low literate people and observed them. I would speculate, and I'll start with the speculation, that somebody who has a formal education level of first grade in India, a poor person, versus somebody, if you compare that person to somebody with a first grade education in the US, adults, let's say 40-year-olds, I would speculate that the person in India has a higher level of functional literacy. Now, why am I saying that? The reason I'm saying that is, in India, for poorer neighborhoods, it is a very one-on-one world. It's a world where people have tremendous counting skills. They can give you the right change, irrespective of their literacy level. They go to the doctor prescribes something. They can pattern match and go to the pharmacy, buy the medicine, pattern match it to make sure it's the right one, go back to the doctor, ask the doctor if it was the right medicine. And the doctor will help out and say yes. It's a very one-on-one world where I can ask somebody on the street for help. It's a one-on-one world where I deal with a vendor. I buy generic products. And I may be a vendor myself. And so I've learned some very basic skills, but I've learned them in a one-on-one world, not in the classroom. Now, if we now transfer to the US, we are talking about low literate people with stigma attached to it. In a high literate world, a high-tech world where they are going to large chain stores, they are seeing so much information on nutrition labels and all of that, and they have people with high technology adding up. And so here I am in this high-tech world, and why won't I hide? I'm going to hide because, as you pointed out earlier, there are certain things I can depend on to negotiate. I'm going to stay there. That's my comfort level. And it turns out that, as long as I'm willing to get cheated, or as long as that's one of the, kinds of price I pay, I am going to basically somehow negotiate this world, but I'm not going to learn much about, in terms of my basic skills. So that is the isolation that I was talking about and the passivity that I was talking about. It's ironic, but it's ironic that in a poor neighborhood in India, you can, if you have a little bit of formal education, or you have a little bit of experience, maybe learning a trade or something like that, you can somehow use that one-on-one world and your skills can start developing. Whereas here I find that, and I'm speculating because again, I think what I've done is more in terms of what can happen rather than how often it happens. Here I find that people are quite isolated. And what they're dealing with are large stores and so on. In India, you have an economy for the poor, literally, and the economy for the middle class and higher. And so, the poor can go to the sidewalk and they can buy things and so on, and they learn to negotiate and they learn to manage change, and they can ask people for help. And the stigma is not as high because there are so many other people in a similar state. There's almost a camaraderie there. It's a strange comparison, but I think, if I were to bet that's where I would bet that, if you take the same formal education level, functional literacy would be higher there because it takes less in some ways to negotiate. There's less of high tech and so on.
That makes sense at a number of levels. I mean, first of all, functional has to occur. You can't use the word except in a context. What you're describing is a radical difference in the context that determines what's functional and what's not functional. The other thing that bears on the conversation that seems really important is the emotional dimension, and that's a context of society too. In places where literacy isn't as critically important to the society as a whole, then not being as literate isn't going to be as psychologically painful as it is in other places, right? So in the United States. So it makes perfect sense what you said, and that it couldn't be otherwise, both in terms of the functional context of literacy and the emotional dimension of it as it relates to how the society views literacy.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think what happens is literacy and income kind of reinforce each other. The kinds of places I've gone to are very low income places in India, urban and rural. And there's almost, as I said, there's a camaraderie and there's, about livelihood and somehow making it. And there's a camaraderie about literacy as well. Whereas I think both could be stigmas in a society, in a Western society. Certainly in the US, both of them could be stigmas. The reason why there is so much despair is it's partly literacy, and it's also partly the feeling that because of my low level of literacy, somebody else thinks I was trying to get away and that I don't have enough money. And so there's an interplay there as well. I think both could be stigmas in this society.
In India, it's less likely that some woman's going to wait for her, brother to come across the state line to take her to the market. She's going to feel more comfortable with being able to speak up for and deal with, that realm of society that she's functioning in. She's less ostracized. She's less insulated because of how she feels about, and less insulated because of the complexity of the environment she's in.
Again, I think if you look at complexity, absolutely. I mean, there are simpler transactions. There are more basic needs being addressed. Now, the poverty level, of course, it's, the poverty level is extreme. So, in that sense, it's not, obviously, it's not a direct comparison, but it is less complex in terms of having to deal with so many different technologies and so many products and so much information. It's a simpler world, and also very often the basic needs are the ones that are being addressed. You raised a very interesting issue in terms of how these skills could develop. When I found people who were very low in terms of skills, they were often people who had a very low level, no education, and somehow for several reasons they had no experience. But I think in India, the moment, something gives you a stepping stone. It could be a little bit of literacy, it could be a little bit of experience, could be being a vendor. People quickly seem to develop their skills because it's an environment where they can learn through these one-on-one interactions. We found, for example, there were women who had essentially been at home for 15 years, managed the household, but the husband would be in charge of pretty much, buying and so on. And the woman, both as a consumer and as a seller, the woman would have no experience. But along comes circumstances, along comes a situation where the husband becomes dysfunctional for a variety of reasons. And we know cases where the woman manages the household, is the consumer, and is the entrepreneur. So with low level of literacy, and almost no experience, we know of examples where there's something inherent which led them necessity to, make a livelihood, and they turned out to manage a complex small business when the need arose. I don't know if there was learning along the way or what it was, but amazing examples like that. Now, I'm obviously absolutely in speculative territory. But I think here, very often, people work in a very narrowly constrained role. It could be at a McDonald's or something like that. and they don't necessarily develop the breadth of experience and so on, where suddenly one day, 15 years into living in extreme poverty, and your husband becomes dysfunctional. And we know of examples where the woman steps forward, she's the consumer, she takes care of her children, she's the entrepreneur, the buyer and the seller. There are amazing stories like that. Some of it, so those were some of the things that we observed.
So the transformation that happens when people have an opportunity to break out of their bubble, and how literacy plays into that. Well, Karen's warm up. One of the things that I was probing you about, some of the methodological questions, is I'm really interested in reaching out and making some connections between the National Center for Family Literacy and researchers to join a shared research project. And I'd like to talk with you about that apart from this interview at some point.
Absolutely. I have a little bit of so-called, relative expertise in method. I just had a book that came out earlier this year on SAGE. It's on measurement, error, and research design. And I didn't mention this earlier, but I call that my left brain research. And the qualitative, the kinds of things we were talking about, is more my right brain research. And both of these have been in the last few years. So I'm very interested in research methods in general. So.
We'll make sure that we cycle back to that.
Yeah, and I think I've used a variety of different methods.
Right. I understand the reason you went the way that you went, and one of the things that all the literacy institutions in this country are struggling with now is how to develop some kind of a profiling system and assessment system that will allow them to plug in the effects of their various programs and services and measure them in some way that will be credible to the foundations, funding organizations, Department of Education. All of the soft money for the warm and fuzzies is drying up fast all over the country. It's time to take good ideas and make them tractionable by virtue of the research wraparound. So I'm having conversations with people like James Heckman, right, the economist, Nobel Prize winner, and Art Rolnick at the Fed, who are developing stunning theoretical arguments for the value of investing in children at certain phases, just in terms of economic productivity in the country. There's an awful lot going on, but there's some big gaps, and the gaps require new kinds of thought that's happening concurrent with credible research thinking about how to research the effects.
Sure.
And so, anyway, we'll come back to that, but I have a sense that we're going to be, we will enjoy working together in that space.
Sure, absolutely.
Are you rolling?
We are.
Okay.
I have a question. Robert Wedgeworth, when we spoke with him, he referred something to fruits and vegetables. And I'm not sure if this is your work or if he was referring specifically here to someone else. But saying that low literates tend not to buy enough fresh fruits and vegetables in their households, simply making abstract connections between the names of these strange-looking objects. Is this familiar ground?
Actually, I think he may have been referring to somebody else's work, but it's an interesting issue. I think people learn, often people at low levels of literacy learn about what's healthy maybe from their mother or grandmother or something like that. And then they say, well, yeah, I have enough greens in my diet and so on. And if you ask them though and what their typical diet is, I mean, you see that, well, it plays a small role, and there are a variety of other things going on. We've looked at this issue from the angle of nutrition education materials. And our contention is that the materials tend to be very abstract, and they are written to a much higher reading level. And so we've tried to develop materials that are more pictographic and that capture the marketplace to a greater degree. That is, the way people see these things at the store. And so we are actually testing that in the state of Illinois right now in terms of its effectiveness and so on.
I appreciate I think most people are turning the research such as you are doing, to the extent that it's available, into firepower, ammunition, argument for why we need to invest in better literacy programs. And what you're doing, both feeds that circuit, but it also says, no, we need to develop materials that will reach the people that are low literate, where they're low literate, and communicate with them within their means, within their ability to communicate, rather than just trying to be preventative to somebody else in the future.
Well, thank you for saying that. I think that what you just said fits perfectly with what we've done in India as well. In India, what we have done based on our research is we've developed a consumer and entrepreneurial literacy program for low literate individuals, low income individuals. And there again, our basic contention is that we can teach or we can train people who have very little formal education, who can't read or write, but we can train them in terms of entrepreneurial literacy, being better at running a business, being better consumers, because we can tap into their experience. We can tap into their lived experience. And we've developed a program, now we need to assess it a lot, in the future, but we've developed a program where we teach people to think conceptually, to think in the abstract about some very basic concepts. In the Indian context, being a buyer and being a seller are really two sides of the same coin. And so we developed a program where on the first day we teach people the basics of an economy. What's an exchange? How has an exchange evolved over time? And we assume our audience cannot read or write. And people are able to relate back and say, aha, so that, here you've given me a concept. Here you've given me a concept of, say, a value chain, which is a set of multiple exchanges. So we teach them that, and then on the second day we ask them to be buyers, and we set up shops and we cheat them, and we point out a variety of ways in which they could be cheated based on our research, about 20 different ways in which they get cheated, and essentially all we are bringing to the surface are things that they know already, and
using their collection of possessed concrete operators and assembling ways that they interrelate that they can get, not unlike they would get in a verbal conversation, that allows them to bypass literacy as a mechanism for becoming functional in these dimensions.
Yes, we use sorting tasks. We use pictorial tasks. We ask them to relate back to their experience. For example, on the first day we give them a task where we have pictures. We have a picture of a farmer, a picture of a fruit shop, a picture of a wholesaler, a picture of money, and we ask people to sort it, saying what's most important. And people generally put money in the middle. And so, we take their work and we put it on the wall, and literally at the end of the training, there's a bunch of pictures on the wall. On the second day, we try to coalesce around this concept of value, which is what are you giving up, what are you getting? And what you give up is more than money. I mean, here you are, you want to go visit somebody, you want to travel for 20 miles just to get something cheaper. What about your time? What about, a lot of other things along the way, other costs? And then what are you getting for it? So we use the notion of value, an abstract concept, to try to explain a lot of these things.
But you get to value by using an assembly of first-person concretes that they're used to.
Yes.
Rather than assuming some kind of literacy as a medium.
Yes. We use, it's examples. It's actually telling them that here you are in a store, we cheat them and this and that, and then that's how we try to bring this out. A role playing, we have a quiz where they listen to some dialogue which is very familiar to them and so on. And by the third day, we tell them, now you're an entrepreneur, now you're a seller. And interestingly, in the third day, we give them the same sorting task, and by the third day, people take the picture of the customer instead of the picture of money and put it in the middle, and they say, hey, without serving a need, we can't exist. And and this is the essence of I would say marketing with a capital M, not the small marketing, which is often in the vernacular saying, hey, how do I sell this somehow, whether you need it or not, but marketing as in how do I run an organization, achieve my objective, but I do that by making sure I serve a customer need honestly, and I make sure the customer gets value out of it. And so it's amazing because sometimes in the classroom at a university, it's hard for people to unlearn their notion of small marketing and then get at what their sense of it is. And here we do it, and when that happens, it's just so satisfying. And then we use that notion to go through, how do you design a product, how do you understand the customer, how do you research in a very informal way. So we try to demystify a lot of these things, and we believe they're all demystifiable. I mean,
I agree with you. Well, I mean, my sense is that we've definitely got to turn up the learning about literacy everywhere we can. And I like what you're doing to say, look, for some of these people, we're not going to bring up their literacy as cost efficiently, cost optimally, as we're going to teach them ways to be functional that don't depend on literacy to the same degree.
As you were describing it, there's one example that came to mind. We trained 20 women in a village. And I think we did two things for them. I think that the skills are in there, they're inherent, but they were brought out because somebody was willing to spend 45 hours for 5 days on people who essentially had been bypassed by the educational system. The second part of it, I think, was it gave them confidence. And it was interesting, we went back 3 months later and they were telling us how now the shopkeepers say, hey, these are the women who got training. We'll give you a deal, just go away, all right? We'll give you, whatever you want. They learned their rights, and they learned that they could go argue with their husband and say, I'll buy. They learned that, we can switch shops. They learned to bargain. And in India, one of the things you need to survive is a mouth. You need to be able to talk. And that's what they'll all say. And I think we, with these kinds of training programs, it's really, it's the skills, yes, but I think the skills are in there. We are just bringing it out in a sense that we are using some concepts to let them use their lived experience really and relate it back. But I think it's more the confidence, it's the awareness of rights that come out as well. And I think it comes out because I believe that certainly my associates there are so dedicated in the way they go about teaching. And so we've had a very good experience. We have people, water shortage, child is ill, whatever, that we have almost perfect attendance. And we have people who I believe have learned. And in India, one of the important things is if you teach a woman in a poor neighborhood, you've taught the whole family. Very often it's a woman who's doing a lot of the, it's so important, I think.
Excellent.
Well, I know we talked about functional literacy in the different context of the U.S. versus India. Can you give us any kind of a number, percentage scale of how many functional illiterate people there are in India?
That's a very good question. The big problem is measurement. And I think there are all kinds of measures. So if you looked at formal literacy, so if we take functional literacy out and we looked at formal literacy obviously in India will be much lower than in the US. That is formal literacy as in reading, counting, in a more formal kind of a setting, or in terms of form. There's no doubt about that. But my argument is that I think there is an interaction between the nature of the environment there and the ability or the opportunities to learn, where at least in a consumer realm, what I've seen is the functional literacy there for somebody who's at the same level of basic literacy or formal education would be higher. And here it would be here I think the issue is the nature of the environment and so on, where it would be lower. In terms of numbers, even in the US, there are people who know so much more about this topic than I do. But it's interesting how this whole measurement of literacy has evolved. And again, it goes back to individuals hiding from a census and then countries hiding from the world. I think for quite a few years, and I may be wrong on the actual details, the way literacy was measured was by a census question, right? Are you literate? And I think the literacy rate was 99%. And it was only when people was given tasks, right, writing a check and so on, that there was a much higher rate of illiteracy. And now, of course, the approach since the 1992 survey has been more on saying, here are some skill levels. Rather than saying somebody, making an either-or kind of a decision, here are some skill levels, here's the level 1, here's level 2, and level 1 and level 2 is a sizable part of the population. So my guess would be that, clearly the literacy level would be a lot lower in India or many of the kind of the transitional economies. But I'm saying if you take somebody with the same quote-unquote basic literacy level, that the functional literacy story would be quite different.
Yeah, makes perfect sense to me. It comes back to the context of operation, which is why socially, emotionally, and economically, literacy is just so much more critical here.
Mm-hmm.
Because not that it won't be everywhere else over time as we go forward into the future, depending on what changes, what mediums change as technology changes, but Whitehurst talked about it. More and more, the basis for competitive distinction for business in America is ever more dependent on higher levels of literacy.
Yes.
Don't wax up. So people that aren't in that stream are at a disadvantage in terms of how well they can function in this society.
Yes.
And over there, it's not the same. And as a consequence of that, they can be more functional according to the standards of that society than they can be here for the same level of literacy or the same level of poverty.
Yeah, and I think that's the other side of the coin. One side is to be a better consumer, but the other side is to participate in value creation and then, to essentially move up economically as well. And that's why, what we're doing in India in a very, very small way is both the consumer and the entrepreneurial literacy. There's been some recent work that points out how multinationals can serve people in those kinds of environments and also be profitable. Some recent books that have come out, and how the consumers there, even the poorest in terms of the billions in the world, particularly in India and China and several other places as well, can participate, and they are willing to be aware of brands and technology and so on. And there have been several books that have come out recently, and sometimes various terminology has been used, such as bottom of the pyramid and base of the pyramid and so on. And what I would argue is not only can they function as knowledgeable customers, they can be entrepreneurs as well. And that would be my emphasis on this, and they can participate in value creation. So I think, yes, being consumers is one thing, looking at people as consumers is one thing, but how do they participate in the value chain? And the point you raise is very relevant in this society as to how they would participate in the value chain. I keep going off on a tangent, but there was one gentleman we talked to who was working at a McDonald's. And he was I believe from the Middle East, if I remember right. And he was not literate in his own culture, and he didn't know English. And he was working at a McDonald's. And I don't know the sequence of events, but at one point, maybe when he was new in town, his wife wanted him to get some salt to cook. And he couldn't say the word salt. He didn't know what a package of salt looked like. And so he goes to a store in town, and he basically asks the employee there. And the employee, now how does he tell the employee that he wants salt? Well, he came up with an ingenious way. He looked at the employee, he gestured, he put a pinch of salt in his mouth, and he gestured. And he said, somehow he communicated that's what he wants. And that employee has taken him around the store, poured the contents out until he found the salt. So here's a remarkable example of, customer service as well. But I don't know the sequence, but I know that later on, or perhaps at the same time, this person was working at a McDonald's. And this was his skill level. Now this is a very important issue of English as second language and literacy, and the compounding effects of these two, and unfamiliarity compounding, and that is an increasingly important issue as well with immigration and things like that, I think.
Excellent. Anything else?
Yes, there's a quote. Can I see this? There's a quote. It's very close to what you just remarked on. I believe this is your quote. The ingenuity and positive attitudes displayed by many functionally illiterate consumers are a testament to human resilience and creativity.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Would you say that for us? I think it's the human resilience. That's what we're seeing time and time again with so many of these people that we're interviewing. Is you wonder how do they keep going day in, day out through these challenges, through the psychological dimensions. I just think that's beautiful.
Absolutely. I mean, and that is why this has been so rewarding. I've stayed at this for 8 years, and I intend to stay for a long time. And I think here I am, a person going back to research methods, who would essentially run experiments. I've done surveys and all that, and I really didn't want to look at my respondent. I mean, the numbers will come and I'm going to crunch them and, go from there. And I was completely transformed in terms of the interviews I've done. Every individual I've talked to has taught me something. And every individual has told me a story. And it's been very rewarding. And the same thing in India, the same thing here. And I think it's very important to listen to the story sincerely. That's both ethical, to do, and it also gets you, more insights. Now, this is an area where there's a lot of room for exploitation, particularly the way the scientific process works. Let's say I send a paper out for review, and so it comes back saying, well, you need more evidence of concrete thinking. Now, what am I going to do? Well, I could go and, look for weaknesses and try to exploit so I can get a nice quote in a paper. But it's so important to resist that as well, and to understand that human being on the other side of the table or the other side of the interview. So it's been very rewarding from that point of view as well, and met some great human beings, very resilient human beings who are where they are because of some circumstances many years ago. But they have learned to negotiate beyond the fact that they did not learn to read or write or count or whatever. And so that has been amazing.
Excellent. That's a great note. Well, I'm content. I think we've got a number of little jewels sprinkled around here that fit some of the places that we were interested in. I've had a great time meeting you, and I look forward to even your 2 points ago about immigrants and the difficulties that are unique to ESL and reading, and the NCFL spawned an organization called the Hispanic Family Learning Institute that's very concerned with that. And there's a lot of conversation right now about going off in different directions that I think would really benefit from collaboration with you. I'm content. How about you? Is there anything else that you think would be important to contribute, or that strikes you as again, you kind of understand generally where we're coming from.
Sure.
Having to do with, I think the place where it intersects most with you is the psychological consequences of low literacy in the everyday behavior, part of which is consumer, and the stories, that accompany that. So if there's anything else in that space that you think would be important to share?
I think my purpose, I would say, as a researcher, is to incorporate literacy and poverty into psychological research and business research. To me, that is kind of the broader goal here. Not as doing one study and saying, wow, for the sensational value, but theoretically to try to bring this in so that, you know, people pay attention to it and incorporate it instead of saying, well, it's too difficult to do, and so I'm going to have my models, but it's going to be based on a certain level of literacy and so on. So to me, that is a larger purpose. And I think the second issue, and again, I've been at it for a while, is I really believe in in the dissemination side. And some of it is applied research, but I think some of it is also trying out some interventions and seeing how they work. So that's really been a path I've taken, and I've had the luxury to take it, being at the University of Illinois, which is a wonderful place to be for a variety of different things in terms of interdisciplinary work. So those are just, I think, a couple of themes that underlie some of this. So, but it's my pleasure, and it's an honor to be interviewed by you.
Let's sit down. Keep talking. Let the lights cool.
Sure.